Welcome to our series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. And today we continue this idea, more than an idea actually, Sraddhalu's experiences on free energy and space travel.
Mm-hmm.
So you were going to begin with a story for us.
Yes, right. Last time we discussed the technologies of being able to overcome gravity, which these beings coming from other planets seem to have developed, which we also saw that on Earth, scientists have been exploring these since the 1920s at least, and maybe even earlier, and the technologies have been developed, have been even mastered on a certain level in the military programs, but then they have been suppressed for various reasons. And allied to the technology of overcoming gravity is the technology of drawing free energy. Well, we use the word free because it's not energy that you have to pay for to buy a fuel. All of our current human society has organized its energy needs around fossil fuels. At least that's how they are called. They may or may not be always fossil necessarily, but it's oil from the ground which is being drawn out and then burnt to drive your cars or to generate electricity. And you have a few variants which involve dams, damming rivers which create electricity, or nuclear energy, which is also extremely destructive, even more destructive than fossil fuels.
Some solar in the deserts of America.
A little bit
huge
of solar
areas,
energy.
but
And I remember when solar energy was being encouraged in the ashram, that was part of one of the programs that Mother had for Auroville, because she saw that direction for the future. I remember at that time it was considered such a novelty that mainstream would look at solar energy, oh yeah, let them do their own little thing while we do the real thing. And nuclear technology was being promoted so powerfully at the time. And here in the ashram we had this whole unit for solar energy research. And Dr. Chamanlal Gupta was at that time one of the, or probably the most reputed person, most respected in this field in the whole of Asia. And so when the Indian companies, Tata, wanted to develop the Tata Energy Research Institute, they approached him. And he said, I have one condition, I won't leave the ashram. So they built their entire research institute in Pondicherry just because he was here. And he was of course consulting for Auroville as well as for the ashram. And he is one of the most reputed scientists in the field even today. But she wanted this for Auroville. And there's an interesting thing she said about nuclear power. She said that the atom is something which nature has taken a very long time, billions of years, to build. And to break it is to go against the will of nature. Now this is the vocabulary she is using. And later she explains some of it. She says that when they break the atom, the habit by which nature holds it together, that habit weakens. Now this goes back to a very deep principle of science. You see, when you look at pure physics, you go down all the way to subatomic particles. The question could be asked, why are the particles the way they are? Why do they move the way they do? What makes for those laws? And we don't have an answer. That's how it is. And Sri Aurobindo explains that these are habits of nature. They are grooves along which nature has created a habit of movement of energy by repeating it everywhere in the universe for so long that it becomes the norm, instinctive. And so when you reverse that and break the atom, you are weakening that habit. And so Mother's observation, she says, well, it's harmful. And then she says, as an afterthought in a positive direction, she says, well, perhaps it will lead to a creation which will be even more plastic because of the weakening of the habit.
Fission, not fusion.
She did not use those words. She just inclined herself towards something which goes in the same direction as nature, to unite atoms rather than break atoms,
exactly.
Which is fusion rather than fission. But this observation is interesting, that the weakening of this may lead to a creation which will be more fluid, more elastic. because you've weakened the rigidity in nature. And so it's as if the supramental force can use anything. There's another example though. She wanted solar energy, obviously. She said, taking energy from above is the right way and not from below. Now this is very interesting as a symbolism. When you dig into the earth, what are you digging to? Well, the dead fossils, the dead plants, the old, million-year-old thing. It's the past, it's the inconscient. Dying, dead, inconscient, which you take from below to fuel your life. And even in the symbolism, you can see that it belongs to the past. And the future is to look up to the source of energy which is clear, free, fresh, from the sun. So Mother did speak of energy from the sun as being the future.
I think she also said all the energy you need can be received from the sun.
Exactly. So the question, of course, is the sunlight it? If you go purely by the physics, the sunlight is not enough to give all that you need. Obviously, the sun is putting out more than just sunlight. It's putting out life energy, prana. And so we have to look a little more deeply. If the sun is giving off all these things, of which sunlight is a tiny part, you can tap into those other things also. And if you could tap into it just as putting a solar dish or solar cell gives you free energy, you tap a little deeper and you will have enormous free energy. And that would be enough for all our needs. Is that possible? So here comes an interesting thing. I was researching this whole field for many years, and particularly looking at the physics behind it, behind the free energy, because as we discussed last time, the experiments in this field have been going on for many decades. One of the earliest scientists who has worked in this field, not only overcoming gravity but even extracting energy from the ambient environment, is Nikola Tesla.
Yes.
Who was not only able to do this successfully, but who was then attacked viciously and his work destroyed, his laboratory burnt, years of work of his laboratory notes were destroyed because he had got into this space which certain forces did not want. And he was premature. Later on, once he had crossed a certain threshold of inventions, where he literally created everything that we have today. Let me elaborate on this and I come back to this point. All the electricity you use, the entire generation system, to your AC motor, to the three-phase power supply transformers in between, neon lamps, CFL lamps, short of LEDs, but all the other light systems, all were invented by him. Robotics, radio wave communication, and a very sophisticated kind of information to be transmitted with multiple channels of data being transmitted. All of these were demonstrated by him. He demonstrated also some of the other things which were outstanding, which were so far out as experiments that people at that time didn't understand what he was doing. He became master of lightning. Not only he knew how to manage, he could recreate lightning in his laboratory on a scale which to this day has not been replicated. And he created a machine which was able to pulse lightning and transmit electricity in a manner that at a distance of 10 kilometers you only had to turn the antenna in the direction of his transmitter, you had bright light, but without any dangerous radiation in between. He was using intense fields, electric and magnetic, where you could put your hand in and nothing would happen to you, but you could put a piece of iron and it would melt. So he was playing with energies of such intensity, but yet they were safe. And there was a point where he said he had got it to a level of precision that he could pulsate this energy until the entire Earth's electromagnetic field was pulsating with his transmitter. And so he could radiate energy to any point of the Earth at will with practically zero cost. And a single waterfall would be enough to run his device and provide energy for everybody. That's when his transmitter, which he was working with, was taken over, broken and destroyed. And so at that point he withdrew. And he made an interesting observation. He had literally built up the entire electric age. As I said, even today everything we use is invented by him. And he said, the present belongs to you, but the future belongs to me. He continued to develop instruments, experimenting, but he didn't bring it into public domain. He announced what he had done. He had patents registered, but most of them even today are classified. Some of them are still available, which are more mild. But the more dangerous ones have been classified, but they were being developed by him. And so all of that goes into this domain which he recognized was too far ahead of the current human development and age. And so he accepted that reality and just continued his work. All of these crazy experiments, which to this day we don't fully understand, you will find Sri Aurobindo describes in Savitri. When you have the three soul forces, the Madonna, the three Madonnas, and then the warped echo from the ego which comes in response. And there's a description of the human ego saying, I have done this and I will do this. And much of it has to do with science. Many of the things described there, Nikola Tesla had actually done. So it has been my conclusion that he represented a vibhuti. He was a vibhuti that came for the purpose of pushing forward the science of that age and literally forming the framework of the electric society which we have today. So that's one part of the story. In that, he was able to tap into that free energy as part of his work. Subsequently, we find literally dozens of scientists rediscovering not one way but many ways to approach it. And once you understand the principle behind how you can tap into this free energy which is everywhere, then you will find there are in fact many approaches in which this can be done. So my exploration in this started very early. When I was 12, I looked at the future and I said, it's not going to happen unless we have anti-gravity and free energy. It was obvious that the future needed this, otherwise we would destroy the earth. And so at that point, it was a bit premature perhaps, but it was the turn of my aspiration. I began to study physics with the intention of being able to understand what these experiments were like and to develop the vocabulary to articulate these principles and ideas. So I first went into Einstein's theory of relativity and built up from there. I even read Einstein in his original while I was at school level, and I discovered that something had gone seriously wrong. Einstein had removed from science the ether. And the ether is the unifying principle. Ether is the medium through which you tap this energy. Ether is the life force that the sun is putting out, which allows you to tap humongous amounts of energy at any point. Current physics comes to this conclusion in an indirect way. They call it 0-point energy. That is, at any given part of space, the density of the underlying energy, real energy, which forms the whole universe, is so great that in a tiny cubic centimeter of empty space, so-called empty space, there is enough energy to evaporate all of the oceans of the earth instantly. Now, if you take a billionth of a billionth of a billionth of that, it's enough to run your whole house, and your cars, and your spaceships, and everything else. And it will be purely the electric age. Because when you tap into that energy, the most easy form in which you can extract it, in its purest way, is electricity. And you can have enormous amounts of electricity anywhere with a very simple device. So now we come back to the mother. So while doing this whole exploration, it was obvious which way we had to go, and so I began to review science from this perspective of the ether as a foundation, because that's the Vedic perspective. That's what Sri Aurobindo says. Remember, Einstein threw out the ether, not proved that it doesn't exist. He said, let's assume it doesn't exist.
Yeah, in his letter to Amal, he speaks of that, and he just disregards it.
So 1905 is when he threw out the ether. 1915-16, when Sri Aurobindo is writing the Life Divine, he tells you, ether can and does exist. Even in the synthesis of yoga, in his writings on the Upanishads, in his essays on the Gita, everywhere the ether principle as the 5 elements and the basis of 5 elements is described. But in particularly in the Life Divine, where he is describing the physics of particles, of matter, he says ether can and does exist, even if to our present instruments it's not measurable. So what he's saying is it is at a level of subtlety that you can't measure doesn't mean it's not there. Now, given this background, can we rebuild physics on the basis of an ether? And the result is a physics which unifies all the forces, and one of the implications is that not only you can draw energy freely anywhere, but the technology for drawing it is also obvious and simple. Like I mentioned in our previous discussion, if you explain it to somebody, you can hack it in your garage with a little bit of skill. It's that simple. And the other part, which is the extraordinary implication, is you also can explain gravitation as one of the forces. You can explain it and therefore reverse it or modify it. Current physics considers gravitation as a fundamental force, along with electromagnetism and strong force and weak force. Doesn't explain it. It just says it's there. Somehow it's there, we don't know how it is. Every particle has gravity. How? We don't know. It's not an explanation, it's a description. But when you go back to the etheric foundations, and in the way Sri Aurobindo explains how the 5 elements emerge, he tells you the secret of all forces, how they emerge. And with that knowledge, you can literally modify gravity or recreate it or intensify or reduce or whatever. That knowledge is there in Sri Aurobindo's writings, and it's something which we have to someday enter into and perhaps even develop for its implications. But so I come back to the mother's observation. While doing this research, I said, somewhere we must have had some insight that the mother makes. So I asked a few of the old sadhaks, did you ever discuss with the mother about the future of energy and so on? And I found one sadhak who had, and that was Pranabda. He was one of mother's attendants. And when I asked him this question, he said, oh yeah, that's true. I asked the mother, or mother said this. And she said, in the future, this is how he put it, in the future, we will not need these electric wires. If you go back to Pondicherry of that period, every road had these pillars, pillar posts with 3, 4 or more wires which brought the electricity to your house. This is the case everywhere on earth in those days. Subsequently, the cables went underground, but they're still there. You need cables. Where is the electricity generated? A few thousand miles away. From there, it has to be transmitted all the way here with these high voltage cables hanging, conversion of transformers, etc. But you are far away from the generation. And of course, you have to pay because it has to come to you and you can measure how much comes. You have to keep paying money. So mother's observation was, in the future, all of this wiring will not be required because every house will have its own source of electricity. And then she said, it'll be a box about this much, this size. It'll give all the electricity you want. And then something more, she said, it will emit a bluish light. Now what was fascinating was, in my research, I had come to one of the conclusions that in order to tap into this, you had to use high voltages to pulsate the ether, to be able to extract energy from it. And one of the side effects of that high voltage is a bluish corona. And there you had mother saying, a bluish light around this little box this size, and Pranabda showed me like that, So what's the size of that? Like a typical stabilizer which you may have at home, one audio player, amplifier, that's about the size. You plug it in somewhere and it powers your whole home. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And the technology for this has been already discovered. So now I'll come to my explorations further. I looked around on the internet. I studied all those people who had claimed to find it, went into their patents, some of them went to the descriptions. Some of them tried to hide the secret because they thought they can make money out of it. So a few things were there, photographs were there. And among them I discovered one, and this I discovered in the 1990s. Internet was just fresh. And there was a community in Switzerland where there was an inventor who had developed a machine which gave off electricity, and it had 2 spinning discs. And they had put up the video of it at that time. So I remember seeing the video, and then they took it offline. And I said, well, I wish someday I could go and meet that guy. And at that time I was never traveling out of Pondicherry. So many years later, I think it was 2009 or 10, I was invited to a program in Switzerland. It was my first trip to Switzerland proper. And I told my hosts, I'd like to go to that place if it's possible. I had no idea of distances. It turned out that place was barely 20 minutes away from where I was. But my host said, "Oh no, that's very far away." And I didn't realize, Switzerland is so small, you can drive from one end to the other in 3 hours. For them, half an hour is very far away. And there was some confusion. They said, "Oh, but that's a community, they are weird people, we don't have anything to do with them, we don't respect them." And it was a spiritual community, which was not of the conventional religion of Christianity of the space. So they considered it weird. So I said, well, okay, I was totally dependent on them. I said, okay, that's how it is. The next year I had to go for some other program. And this time it was somebody from Oroville who was helping to organize. And I told her, if you can, I'd like to go there, to that place. She wrote to them. They said, oh, we don't allow visitors. That's a spiritual community. They have had enough of people harassing them. So I said, we don't allow visitors. Then she wrote saying, no, we are coming from a spiritual community. And this is the background of Oroville and the ashram. So, and she sent a photo. And they said, yes, you can come. So that was my first visit. It was a community called Methernitha. You can still see a little bit on the internet. They are very reclusive, very protective, and for good reason, as you will see what happened. So I went there and I had no idea what to expect. It turned out the person who invented the machine was the head of the community. It turned out he was an extraordinary spiritual being, extraordinary in his attainment, in his realization.
How old?
When I met him, he was almost 90, perhaps 89, 90. No, he was already 90 plus, 91, 92, because he died a year later. So I meet him, and the experience in contact with him was so extraordinary. And then he pulled out the machine and placed it before me. The machine which he had made, there was a small version and a big version. The big version they didn't have, or they didn't show, but the small version he showed me, and I could study it, and it was so simple. It is so simple, like I said, you can put the diagram online and people can create it in their garage. It's that simple. And all you had to do was push it. There were 2 discs, push it, counter rotating clock, one clockwise, one anti-clockwise. The counter rotate and it gives off electricity. This little device was giving off 300 watts and the bigger version was giving off 3 kilowatts. That's enough to run an entire house. You start it running and it keeps going, and that's all. You don't have to do anything. No fuels, nothing. Pure electricity. So when he showed it to me, he said, "You're very courageous to come here." And I was wondering why he said that. And he said that they had been so ostracized that initially he used to show his machine freely. That's how all the internet reports came. And at some point, the Swiss military raided their community as a way of threatening. And then somebody from NASA came and told them that if you value your comfort, threatened them basically to stop this. And so he said he had withdrawn the machine completely after that. And then he showed me the little model. At the time when he showed me, it was not working. And I could see why, because these 2 discs which were counter-rotating were tied with something like a rubber band, and the rubber band had come loose. So I wanted to set it right, and I would have been able to see it work, but they wouldn't allow me to touch. So I said, okay, that's good enough. I saw it and that's good enough. What was interesting is, that time when I met him, of course, it was an overwhelming experience because of what he radiated in his presence. And it so happened I had another, 1 month later, another invitation to speak at a yoga conference in Switzerland. And so I said, well, when I come for that, I will come and meet you again. And I went a month later. At that time that he was not well. So he was very aged, and he would literally drift off into sleep because he was so tired. So we were sitting there. I was hoping to have a greater interchange, discuss the machines, but by then I realized this is not just a scientist. He's first and foremost a spiritual leader. And so we were sitting, and suddenly he nods off. And so I wait. After a while, I said, all right, if he's sleeping, meditating, I don't know what, I will also meditate. So I closed my eyes and I invoked the Mother's presence and Sri Aurobindo. And as I concentrated, I felt the contact with their presence. And in the moment that I felt the contact, this man opens his eyes bright and says, "Your friends are most welcome here." And I'm in 2 minds. Is he speaking about my friends like the people I know, or he's speaking about this. And I assumed it's that, but nobody I've met so far talks of things of the higher world as if it's a day-to-day conversation. So I had to literally split. It's the same experience I had when I met him the first time. He was talking here, but he was speaking of things there. And I had to split my consciousness and communicate here while talking here. And it was an amazing experience. I've not met anybody with whom I had to do that. Well, one or two people, but not with this intensity. And he was doing it consciously because he was living like that on these two levels at the same time. It was an amazing experience. And so the second time when he popped up with this, your friends are most welcome. So I'm hesitating, I'm wondering, is he speaking of them or something else? And after a few seconds, he closes his eyes and again he opens and says, are they happy with what they see upstairs? You see, his sacred room was upstairs from where we were sitting. And then I realized he was speaking of the mother and Sri Aurobindo. And I said, I don't know. I can't speak on their behalf, but I said, I don't know. And then he spoke of his friends in India. And that's when I began to understand that he's talking of spiritual beings, and he mentioned certain names, and he said, do you know them? I said, not by those names, obviously. Then he said something about, you see, his vocabulary was very different. He would speak of spiritual station, meaning like a subtle world or subtle, in our vocabulary we would say we have the physical ashram and we have the subtle physical ashram where Sri Aurobindo and the mother are there. And he was telling me about that. He said, you have the station which is there, do you know of it, have you been there, have you been able to enter it? It was an amazing experience. It was the first time I met someone who's so blatantly overt about the inner world and inner realities as if they are his current reality. And he couldn't literally separate one from the other. But so that was a fascinating experience. But that's about all we could do. And he was very keen that I should come back the next year. He wanted to show me things. And I was supposed to travel to Europe, and I had planned to make a detour. And there was a technical problem. I did not get the visa in time. And a couple of weeks later, I got the message he had died. He passed on. And so that opportunity was lost. But in this whole experience, I saw something which was the most valuable for us. Of course, at a very material level, the technology is so simple to tap into this energy, which is universal energy. And it's the future, for sure. No more fossil fuel, no more destruction of the environment. But on the other side, here was a man who was first and foremost a spiritual person, who was also a scientist, technologist, engineer, whatever form you can say, all self-taught. He had not learned these things in school. And when he was asked, how did you make this? Because scientists said, we don't have this knowledge, how did you get it? He said, you only have to ask nature. And nature will give you all the secrets that you want. And he said, I asked nature and she showed me how to do, and that's it. This is what I've done. Of course, it was his way of saying it. But as I understood later through my contact with the community, that he had this extraordinary ability to enter in relation with beings of the higher world or with higher states of consciousness, because he was living literally on these two domains. I heard some amazing stories from people who were there around him. Obviously, they had all gathered because they had this unusual experience with him. So one of them said this. As a young girl, she met him for the first time, and he asked her, have you ever seen an angel? And she said, no. And then he asked, well, can you imagine what an angel would be like? And she said yes, and she had a picture in her mind, and he described precisely what she was seeing. Amazing. And so he was literally living in these two worlds equally, straddling worlds, so to say. And so for him, access to that domain was so spontaneous and effortless. I've heard many extraordinary stories of things around him. He would repair machines. This was one of his skills. As a young man, even as a teenager, people had machines which were not working. He would go there and pull a few levers, bang a few things here and there, and it would start working. An electronic radio device which is not working, he would take it and do something, shake it, it's working, and he would give it back. I met the electrician of the community and he narrated a fascinating story. He said, for many years in one of the houses, because Switzerland gets so cold, they have snow literally in that part, they have snow for like 8 months in a year. And heating was a big issue. And in those days they had no money for fuel. So he had, because he was handling the electricals himself in the early days, he had plugged in wires and developed a whole system, and they had electric heating in certain rooms. So many years later, after he had done this, the official electrician of the community then, who had taken over the work, he was called because some electrical connection wasn't working. So he began to trace back the wires, and he went looking for the source, and the wires went up into the attic. And then he said the wires came up and they were plugged in into 2 nails on the wall, and that was it. And their whole house had been running on electricity coming from these 2 nails. And so in his effort to do that, he looked for the source, and after that, of course, they had no electricity anymore, it was not working. So he had extraordinary occult capacities also. But what it teaches us, and this is the point we should look at, that the knowledge is there. If you bring it into the vocabulary of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, the new world which is waiting to manifest is right here. It's waiting at the gates. All it requires is for us to make the effort to reach out and to receive what is trying to manifest. And these are extraordinary gifts which belong to humanity, which are meant for us, not just for our future, but in our present. It's only the future because we are busy living in the past. If we simply make the correction of beginning to live for the future in the present, then everything is waiting for us, including the necessary technological knowledge, the sciences, and even other deeper, I would say, occult, what is occult to us, but which is to be the revealed knowledge for the future. It's all there waiting. There are conscious beings who represent this knowledge or these powers, who are waiting to serve humanity, and all that is just waiting for us. If only we choose to break away from the past and live for the future now. And that was what Mother wanted us to do here. You remember for the ashram she said, and then for Auroville, she said, I don't want you to repeat what others are doing, because they're already doing it. What's the point? You must try to do what others do not believe is possible, they cannot imagine is possible. That's what we should be imagining and trying to do. And so she was always working for the future, living in the future. And we should do that now.
Savitri says, let us go back to this new world, which is changed but still the same. And that is,
yes.
Yeah.
So, what does the future mean? It means here all these possibilities of energies, forces, powers, engaged or bound into their karmic or other knots and dependencies, which are trying to fructify and become more and more concrete. You can release new forces into it to modify, to redirect from a negative to a positive direction. And that's part of the work which we have to do in our thought, in our emotions. What we put out acts on the future. In our physical actions, we are bound to the present. You can't act in the future because you can't touch the future. But in your thoughts and emotions, everything you feel and think is spreading out and enters as forces for the future. And we have to put out positive thoughts, positive emotions for the future. Align ourselves in consciousness to that future which we aspire for.
In these billions of people on this planet, are there none who are currently working in these areas of free energy?
There are lots of people. There are lots of people who are interested, some who have worked on it also with some interesting results. Inevitably, they tend to be cagey about what they have done or what they are doing, or they just fade out for some reason, which may be simply they were threatened. I have attended certain conferences where I met with people who are interested and keen in the field, And generally I found that they were not very strong in the deeper physics of it. And the biggest problem is they don't have a physical framework in which to be able to explain how the energy is tapped. And that framework we find in Sri Aurobindo's writings or in the Vedic framework from which the physics can be derived. Sri Aurobindo had extraordinary knowledge of this, of which he wrote very little though. There's one text which earlier was published as, it was just titled The First Rik of the Rig Veda, where Sri Aurobindo comments upon it. And there he describes how Agni operates on 7 levels. There are 7 kinds of Agni. And he describes the working in the physical plane and then on each of the planes with the specific terms in Sanskrit used in the Veda for those levels and their operations. And then he explains how it relates to Vayu and Indra and things like that. And then, having described this, he says, in terms of physics, it means this, and the electrical forces in the sun represent that, and the corona of the sun represents this, etc. And in psychological terms, it represents this. And when he describes the physical part, he says, right or wrong, this is the physics of the Veda. And it's an amazing statement because he's just telling you this is what it is, and he doesn't care whether you call it right or wrong. This is the physics of the Veda, and obviously he gives to it greater credibility than current physics. So he had extraordinary knowledge of this whole field. Unfortunately, it was not tapped, or perhaps he chose not to reveal because it might be premature. But the fundamental principles of it he has given because they span across all these domains. So even as he is describing spiritual or psychological principles, once you have this key, you can also see how it translates into the physical domain. And he has given you enough that we can actually rebuild the Vedic physics with technological implications. But I've not found anybody who has this background. People exploring, yes, but much of it is their experimentation in the blind, without understanding fully what is the principle. But once you get the principle, you can move very rapidly to much more precise and even dramatic results.
Next question is that...
I would want this research to be done in Auroville and in the ashram.
Absolutely.
We are meant to be working for the future.
Absolutely.
What others do not think possible, we should be working on, isn't it?
Mother said that she would be happy to meet one of these beings. Why aren't we meeting them? If they can travel and reach us, are they hiding from us?
No, they have been meeting. They
Have been meeting
yes.
us, yes.
And the documentation of this is extraordinary. One person who has compiled extensively all the documentation and investigated all the cases of people meeting beings from other planets is Wendelle Stevens. And he has more than 60 books, each book documenting such cases. And it is so richly documented, so compelling in the evidence. There are others who have also documented just because of the quality of photographs they have. I mentioned earlier George Adamsky was one who had extraordinary photos, such clear and detailed that you couldn't fake it in the 50s. And subsequently in Switzerland, one Billy Meier was having regular contact with crafts which would come into his area, and he had a whole group of people that he would inform. We have an appointment, they will be coming around this time. So the group would go into the hills and wait with their cameras ready, film as well as still photos. And when the flying saucers would come, they'd be going click, click, click. And you can see in those films as well as photos below on the highway the cars which are going by, and then the flying saucer moving around and then doing extraordinary movements like that, jumping around. Some of them come very close, move around a tree, and you can see the tree moving violently in the closeness of it. And occasionally you have a Swiss military jet which comes and chases the flying saucer. And in one of the videos you can see the jet comes, the flying saucer blinks out and appears elsewhere in the next frame. So you have a film frame that's shooting at 1/25th of a second.
Yes.
Within 1/25th of a second it vanishes here and appears there in the next frame. And then he has also transcribed all his conversations with the beings from those saucers.
So they would come down to Earth?
They would meet with him and he would have conversations which he has documented extensively. He would ask them, how did you manage to do this? And they discuss some of their capabilities. One of the capabilities they have is this ability to cloak, to hide themselves in a way that somebody from below would not be able to see. And they make it available to be visible only in a particular direction. Or they can cloak completely and you would not be able to know that they are there. If you had special instruments, you could register a shift in the magnetic field or electric field and you would know something strong is here, but you cannot see it. So that is one of the technologies that they have developed. There's still one question which we have not touched. How do you travel such a great distance? Because physics says you cannot go faster than light, remember? And that's only Einstein's physics where he removed the ether. When you remove the ether, remember, ether in physics was the medium in which light was a wave. You remove the medium, what is light then? It cannot be a wave anymore, it has to become a particle. And yet it is a wave. So you end up with a wave-particle duality. With the truth of light is it's a wave in the ether. Only you say the ether doesn't exist, so your measurements now have to presume it's a particle. Because you can't have a wave without a medium. But your experiments show it's a wave. But you have to assume it's a particle and you end up with this wave-particle duality which is fake. The reality is it's a wave.
Wavelengths they call it, I think.
Yes. And Sri Aurobindo pokes fun at this in Savitri. When everything seemed almost as if reality had been discovered, everything falls back and becomes a wave-particle dance of particles and things like that. Some passage which is... But then he says, he shows you two models of physics. The clockwork model, mechanical, which is dropped, and then you have the quantum model, which becomes this chance, which also has to drop, and then he says, this will give way to a greater science. And that's the science we have to work for. But coming back to this whole story, how do you move fast? If there is an ether, then the whole basis for light is different. And there is no practical limit to speed. If you remove the ether, then light exists as a particle in a vacuum, and space and time have to bend to maintain the speed of light. It's the only thing which is not relative, because everything else depends on a medium. So you have warped reality and you put an artificial speed limit. You bring back the ether, and light speed is one of those variables. It's a relative speed independent on this local medium of the ether. And just as a plane can go faster than the speed of sound in the air, so too a spacecraft can go faster than the speed of sound, speed of light in the ether. It's exactly the same analogy, a similar technology, only instead of operating with aeronautics, you're operating with etherics. And then you can go faster than the...
What effect would it have on the human body?
Practically none. You would hardly feel anything, because although moving at that high speed, there is the effective isolation from the sense of inertia. In fact, the saucer will rapidly accelerate and you will feel nothing. This is in fact the experience of people who have boarded flying saucers, George Adamsky being one of them. They enter it and then they feel a slight lightness, and then they look through their porthole and they've moved away from the earth already. It's that fast. But they just felt slightly light, a slight shift, momentarily, hardly felt. And with this technology, you can go enormous distances much faster than light, but still it takes time. But there is a further technology which we have alluded to from the mother's observation, that you are able to shift out of the gross physical into a subtle physical layer, and from there you can move much faster, or there may not be a sense of movement at all. You basically tune into a higher grade and then tune back at a different location. And it's like the teleportation of a physical object, which also we have discussed earlier, when you materialize and dematerialize.
Yeah.
So you can dematerialize and rematerialize, and there is no sense of travel at all, but you're there in an instant. The only time required is the time to dematerialize and rematerialize. But all of this is available to us as a humanity, as part of our imminent future, if only we can make the necessary efforts to break free from the stranglehold of the past and move to the future.
I have a question here. A researcher named Dr. Stephen Greer says that the extraterrestrials are more developed technologically, socially, and spiritually than us, and says that we can contact them via meditation. He has been taught by extraterrestrials the CE5 protocol, close encounter of the fifth kind. How does it work?
Okay.
Oh.
You know what are the close encounters of the first kind, second kind, third kind, fourth kind? Well, the fifth kind is where you call them and they respond. There's this famous movie, that's where this vocabulary comes from.
Spielberg's movie.
Spielberg's movie. Close encounters, that was of the third kind, right?
Of the third kind.
Yeah, where you have a physical contact. The first and second kind are where you see at a distance, but you don't have one-on-one contact.
I didn't think much of that movie until the very end, and it was an incredible ending.
Yes.
Extraordinary.
Through many such movies, there has been an attempt to prepare humanity for the reality of these things. The initial portion of the movie is a typical Hollywood, we will use the word masala movie, you know, a little bit of spicing and excitement. But then the point of the movie was the point of contact.
Yes.
With a civilization which is so much more developed technologically, but that's not enough. You may be technologically developed but still egoistically rooted. And if that was the case, then if their goal was to dominate the earth, they would have done it already. But if they're coming in this way and warning us or helping us, trying to help us through a dangerous passage, it's because they have outgrown that and are respectful of our freedom and want to engage on a level of equality with a higher degree, we may say, of spirituality, because at least they've transcended the crude ego. How much more they've grown in consciousness is to be seen, but again, there might be many levels of species in their evolution, but what we do see in many of the close encounters that people have had one-on-one, that many of them seem to be telepathic, that they can sense your thoughts and respond even without your speaking, which shows already a higher grade of mental development. You've moved into the more intuitive consciousness and are able to communicate without needing words or even to project certain ideas. And so the physical, technological development is an independent process from the consciousness process. As far as our human beings are concerned on Earth, our technology has moved faster than our consciousness. And we need to catch up. But if consciousness grows sufficiently, then of course even technology can be assisted from a higher consciousness. And even we will be given higher knowledge to develop the technology more rapidly so that it can be suitable for our current consciousness state. I do believe this is possible for us, even little pockets.
But is it dangerous, this growth of technology being great?
It is enormously dangerous. That is the problem we have. Because we have reached, for example, the stage of nuclear weapons. But consciousness-wise, we are still fighting as if we would with sticks and stones or blows. Except now you have missiles and weapons, so you don't need the physical hand, you push a button and kill the other fellow while killing yourself indirectly in the process. But you don't care because you're driven by the anger or hatred, etc. So having a higher technology for a lower consciousness is extremely dangerous.
So in a way, can it be the nature's way of like suppressing the,
Absolutely.
nature's way of controlling the technological growth because the consciousness is not
Absolutely.
responding?
So this is a very important point. Nature will try to ensure that we do not prematurely develop a technology which could be harmful for us. But what does that mean? Who is nature? Or through whom does she work? So we can say literally there are beings who look after these things, whose job it is to ensure, to help in growth of science or technology or knowledge, or to pull back where necessary if it is going too fast. And I mentioned earlier about Nikola Tesla recognizing that he had gone ahead of his time and choosing to pull back because he was one of those persons who had that connection with the inner world. And he knew he had crossed that threshold, he willingly backed off. But if someone goes too fast, too far, then there will be forces converging to prevent and even to destroy, if necessary. But finally, though, we are always at a balancing point. If you hold back too much, then we stay stuck where we are. It's by allowing a little bit of the danger of the new technology which forces our consciousness to rise up, because it's so ridiculous to use nuclear weapons that we don't want to do it, even though we have to struggle with the urge. And so as a humanity, there's always this very fine balance. Sri Aurobindo refers to two inventions which were premature, before their time, and which were therefore also misused. And one is cinema, and the other is a telephone. Interesting. It's interesting to see the implications, what they did to humanity, and in what way it was premature. Mother wanted cinema to be used for assisting the lifting up of consciousness, the growth of consciousness. What you see today is pretty much the opposite, mostly.
We'll take a few minutes break.
Yes.